Hi friends, welcome back to the channel. In this video, I will be turning these beautiful tomatoes into a lovely freezer-friendly pasta sauce that we will be utilizing for the rest of the year, hopefully. Now, I can't recall the variety of tomatoes or actually how much pounds I ended up purchasing from the local farmer, but the first thing I did once I got home was I started washing the tomatoes and then I placed them on these baking trays for drying. And now today I'm going to start preserving them and turning them into our pasta sauce. Now, making pasta sauce from fresh tomatoes is a fairly easy process. What made this project a little bit more tedious was just the quantity of tomatoes that we had to process today. But first I started off by coring the tomatoes, and that's basically removing the stem and the bottom portion of the tomatoes. And then I placed them back on the baking tray, and then I placed it in the oven for about 15 to 20 minutes to get them not roasted, but just kind of warmed and starting to roast. And what that does is then it allows me to easily remove the skin from these tomatoes. So basically first I got started doing that to all the tomatoes, and then we placed them in the oven. And while they were in the oven, while the first batch was in the oven, I started working on onions and garlic that we'll also be utilizing for this recipe today. Here I am starting to prepare the onions that I will be utilizing for the pasta sauce today. I'm actually very proud that these are the last bit of onions that we actually grew in the garden this year. So they were a little bit small, but they're perfect for this project because we'll be dicing them up and sauteing down and adding them to the pasta sauce. So I was prepping while the first batch of tomatoes was in the oven roasting. I was basically prepping the onions. I also wanted to use some roasted garlic in this recipe, so I went ahead and chopped off the top of these garlic heads And then I sprinkled it with a little bit of olive oil, wrapped it up in a piece of foil paper, and I put it in the oven to roast. And that basically creates this smooth, garlicky type product that I'll then add to the pasta sauce later on. Now our first 2 trays of tomatoes finished from the oven, so we went ahead and added our 3rd tray and the garlic. And this is how the tomatoes look once they're out of the oven. As you can see, they're starting to roast a little bit, and this is exactly what we were looking for, because now you can easily remove the skin and continue on with making our pasta sauce. So we're going to go ahead and let those tomatoes cool a little bit so they're easier to handle, because at this point they're piping hot. So I'm going to let them cool a little bit, and then that way it'll be easy to just pull the skin off of those tomatoes. But while the tomatoes are cooling, I'm going to go ahead in a large pot. I'm going to start sauteing down the onions. So here I'm basically just adding some olive oil to the pot, and then we'll add our chopped onions, and then we'll just continue to stir this as it sautés down. And once it sautés down, then I'll come back and start adding the tomatoes so we can start making our pasta sauce. But we're just kind of doing 2 things at once. So we're just making the onions start to cook down, and then now I'm going to go back and start to remove the skins from our tomatoes that we roasted in the oven. And then we have our second batch of tomatoes that are in the oven right now with the garlic roasting. So we're going to keep on chugging along with this project. So our 3rd pan of tomatoes, it's been about 30 minutes, so that's finished roasting. So I've taken that out, and I have that cooling on our stove top while I'm checking the garlic to make sure it's roasted enough for our recipe, which it is. So now we're just gonna go ahead and place that to the side, and later on we'll just squeeze out the garlic from within the garlic head, and we'll add it to our pasta sauce. Now at this point is when I realized I underestimated how long this project would take, and in all honesty, coring the tomatoes was the most tedious portion of this project. So right now we have processed 3 pans, and I have about 5 more pans remaining. So at this point is when I decided to move ahead with making the pasta sauce from the 3 pans that I have already completed roasting. And then the other 5 pans, I'm going to go ahead and cork the tomatoes, but I'll put them in a Ziploc bag and place them in the freezer. And then later on, I'll come back and either process them into more pasta sauce, or I'll probably just end up making these plain tomato sauce that can be utilized for other recipes. So that's what we're doing now. I'm just continuing to core these tomatoes, which is basically removing the stems, and then I'll put them in Ziploc freezer bags, and then we'll add them to the freezer. And then once I'm ready to revisit this project in the future, I'll take them out of the freezer and add them to probably a roaster or something to make tomato sauce. Our onions have been sauteing on the stove for quite some time, and I've been stirring them occasionally. Now they're pretty softened and they're starting to look translucent. So we're going to go ahead and get started by adding our peeled tomatoes into the pot, and then I'll give it a small mash, and then I'll use my immersion blender to blend this into a sauce. So we're going to go ahead and get started with that step. So I quickly realized that blending the tomatoes in the pot was going to be a little bit of a challenge because they're still whole tomatoes and not small little cubes or chunks. So what I did was I blended this first batch and made it a smooth sauce, but for the remainder of the tomatoes I just blended them in our blender, and then I added the blended sauce to the pot. And that was the more easier and better process. So here we are, we're just blending these tomatoes in the blender, and then I just add the pureed tomato product back to the big pot and give it a good stir, and then we continued on with making our pasta sauce. Once we were finished blending all the tomatoes and adding the purees to our sauce pot, I went ahead and started to season the pot. Now we added the roasted garlic when we were blending the tomatoes, but we added additional seasoning, and at this point you can season to your liking. I added a variety of different seasonings. I added some thyme, oregano, basil, garlic powder, paprika, and salt, black pepper, I think. But basically you can season to your liking at this particular point. And then I just continue to give it a good stir, covered the pot, and let it come up to a small boil. And once it starts boiling a little bit, your pasta sauce is all done. And this is our finished product. The pasta sauce has been finished for about an hour now, and I've just had it cooling so we can get it to be a little bit more over room temperature, and then we'll start packaging the product in our deli containers, which we'll then add to the freezer. But this sauce turned out really good, and if you were here, the smell is fabulous. But basically we're just going to package it into these containers, we'll label them, and then add it to the freezer. And once we're ready to use it, we'll just pull the container out if we're ready to use it for dinner and add it to our dish. Here you have it, friends. This is our finished product. We have our pasta sauce in our deli containers, which we'll add to the freezer. And then for the tomatoes that we didn't get to today, we have them cleaned, cured, and packed away in Ziploc bags that we'll also toss in the freezer. And once we're ready to do part 2 of this project, we'll just defrost them and turn them into another tomato product. Thank you so much for hanging out with us today. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so that you'll be notified when we post part 2 of this project, and that way you'll get to see what we actually decide to do with the remainder of the tomatoes that we froze today. Once again, thank you guys for hanging out with us, and have a good one.